In January of 2000, a traveler visiting Ivory Coast went missing in the jungle. Once it was reported that he had not returned, locals went out and searched for him, but the thick vegetation made it difficult to find one single man. When they finally found the man, he was not himself anymore, showcasing extremely aggressive behavior and a disability to properly speak. The man was the first known victim to be infected with the virus that would later be labeled the zombie virus. Experts suspect that the man was infected with the virus by one of the animals he had direct contact with in the jungle, either by eating its meat or being bitten. When and where exactly the traveler got the virus remains unknown. This incident barely got any news coverage. It was not uncommon for a man to lose his mind and thus got no attention from the rest of the world. In fact, the rest of the world was still enjoying the aftermath of New Year's Eve. With the change of a new millennium and a new century, the people were motivated and government officials from a multitude of countries promised a bright future ahead. The Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok promised to start focusing on industry to keep the Netherlands with its open ports in Rotterdam, the heart of the world's trading routes. To keep up with the times and to lift things off in the new millennium, the government would invest in the research of thermal efficiency, modern construction tools, and modern software. It would keep the scene attractive and opportune for foreign businesses to deal with. It also promised to delve into securing its networks, as the internet was still a relatively new phenomenon. It would be vital for efficient trading and industry in the future, and having the guarantee of secured networks would favor businesses once more to look into Holland's direction. Throughout every province, factories were established to keep up with the growing industry and create employment opportunities. Military-wise, Holland had not much to fear, and thus invested only a tiny bit into weaponry and supply depots. Then, on the 5th of January 2000, Malaysian investigators reported to the international community that several high-ranking members of the Al-Qaeda networks have met in Kuala Lumpur and possibly discussed future actions. Though this got some news coverage over the next couple of days, the news was seen as too indirect to influence the daily lives of Westerners, and thus was quickly forgotten about in the Western media. Instead, America launched its political program schedule, as both Al Gore and George W. Bush had unleashed their political campaigns for this year's election. Then, at the end of January, the Egypt government had informed the global community that its forces had successfully occupied the contested Halaib Triangle, over which Egypt had a long-standing dispute with its southern neighbor Sudan. The Sudanese military had today admitted that a retreat was ordered, while the Sudanese government confirmed that it would not be dropping claims in the regions which it viewed as rightfully Sudanese. One of the world's oldest border conflicts continued onward as the threat in Ivory Coast still went unnoticed. In Germany, the focus lay on making a stronger overall foreign impression, with the focus set on a restructure of the foreign ministry. Chancellor Gerhard Schröder of the SPD promised closer coalitions and opportunities with neighboring countries to strengthen both. Where Germany's look was outward, America looked inward, as the current Democratic President Bill Clinton focused on the American economy itself. With both political campaigns underway and companies standing in line to invest, Clinton thought it was essential and a perfect time to boost the nation's own financial status. At the same time, the unknown virus was spreading in Ivory Coast. Though numbers were not alarming yet, some of the medical personnel treating the missing man started to show similar signs. The spread mostly occurred in the southern part of Ivory Coast, where the man was taken to be treated. In the northern parts of the country, no sign of any infection had been reported. United Kingdom's Prime Minister Tony Blair's perspective was slightly different than that of most countries. Where most governments were focusing on boosting one's financial situation, Blair thought it was wise to set a focus on the UK's military force. Not as a threat, but to keep up with the dominance of the giant military power known as the US. Blair assured the press he did not see it as an arms race, but just as an insurance to stay at the same level, both as close allies. In March of 2000, the situation in Ivory Coast got dramatically worse. The virus had spread all throughout the south, as more and more people started to show erratic and aggressive behavior. a rise in reports of missing people could be noticed. To make matters worse, some of the infection had spread over to neighboring country Ghana. The fact that the virus traversed borders demanded the majority of news coverage in both countries. But the voices of these countries fell on deaf ears, as shortly after, the world was focused on Russia declaring war on Chechnya. There was no doubt who would win in this conflict with the overwhelming power of the Russian army. The war posed as the head of news articles most of the time, but the people felt at ease enough to still focus on their own country and needs. In March, Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok offered his next plan of focus on improving the civilian industry even more. In the next couple of weeks, heavy fighting occurred between the Russian Federation and the armies of Chechnya. The battles resulted in a death toll ranging between 25 and 50,000 dead, most of which were civilians in Chechnya. Shortly after, as was completely predictable, the young political upstart Vladimir Putin, acting president since December 31st, 1999, had been confirmed in his office as president of Russia by popular vote. Putin was internationally perceived as little more than a puppet who got to power simply because he was Boris Yeltsin's designed political successor. But his recent unforgiving policy on the Chechen insurgency has already proved him to be more a resolute leader than some of his skeptics may expect. In the UK, Tony Blair continued his road on the focus on the army. Using the Russian war with Chechnya as a reminder of conflict still possible these days, he assured that his intentions were justified. On concerns of the United Kingdom's own economy, Blair answered that this would be his next focus. In France, the mood was quite different, and more similar to that of the Dutch and Germans. Prime Minister Jacques Chirac aimed to focus on civilian buildup, a focus to strengthen and increase the building and expansion of neighborhoods and cities. The cities of France should be attractive to its own civilians living there, not just for companies looking for opportunities. Experts were expecting Chirac to shift its focus on industry in the northern provinces or even overseas in the near future. Australia was only focusing on one thing, getting everything settled for the upcoming Olympic Games. Though of course the coming of the new games created job opportunities and a general boost in economy, it was also essential to guarantee the safety of the people visiting the country for the games. In order to do this, Prime Minister John Howard shifted its focus to naval and army training in case an incident would occur. Where one would think that more African countries would heed the warnings from nearby Ivory Coast, the truth of the matter was that most of them focused on their own problems and conflicts. The ongoing conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea was still a central issue, as well as increasing tensions between different countries on the continent. Since the virus had not spread to their own countries, by some it was merely seen as a new branch of malaria, and a problem that Ghana and Ivory Coast should both deal with and solve themselves. And so the virus kept spreading and spreading, as in May of 2000 the virus had now also spread to neighboring Liberia and even more provinces of Ghana. Because a third country was now infected, smaller human rights groups in Western countries started to pick up on this unfolding event as well. The interesting thing to note was that through all these months the virus had still not spread throughout the northern regions of Ivory Coast, giving some people the comfort and hope that it could be contained. But once again, most of this news got by unnoticed, as the signing of the Algiers Agreement happened shortly after. Eritrea and Ethiopia were at war since 1998, when border disputes between the two countries exploded into military conflict. The war was long, bloody and pointless, with more than 300,000 Ethiopian soldiers meeting more than 150,000 Eritrean forces on the field of battle. Both countries might have suffered as many as 170,000 dead. Ethiopia, generally speaking, achieved military victory, maintaining control over all disputed areas. Eritrea, however, received international support through court arbitration, receiving about 40% of the disputed regions in the subsequent presentation of the conflict to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. The ceasefire was signed soon after and finalized a few months later. The Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok presented at the end of May its next plan for industrial development. To keep up with the promised industrial focus, its development of new techniques and more efficient ways should not be forgotten. With the increase of commotion in Ghana and neighboring countries concerning the spreading virus, Ghana's president Jerry Rawlings assured the citizens that a solution to the virus would surely be found. Rawlings pointed out the fact that the north of Ivory Coast was still infection-free, implying there might be some hint to an antidote or solution hidden there. Though the issue of the virus was what most citizens in the current active countries were focusing on, most of the world barely seemed to notice it due to its small scale. Tiny articles and footnotes on news channels were dedicated to the virus, but they left it at that. Smaller activist groups did start to assemble to ask the government to be more transparent on the issue and give out information to the people. On the 30th of May 2000, word had gotten out on the retreat of Israeli forces from southern Lebanon. Israel had a partial military presence in the south of Lebanon ever since they supported the Christian militias in the Lebanese civil war in 1982. The Israel military staff had confirmed that Israel completed the retreat from the territory since occupied by them. Lebanese officials had made statements of approval. Then barely a month later, Syria insulted Israel over the Golan deal. After the Israeli government had approached the government of Syria over a possible return of the Golan Heights to Syrian administration, the Syrian government publicly declared that there would be no surrender in front of Israeli Zionists and their evil schemes. The government portrayed the Israeli as Jewish parasites, creating outrage amongst Israeli citizens. Holland continued the industrial development by putting time and effort in the research of gas turbine cogeneration units, but also promised its course made earlier that year of securing its networks by strengthening decryption algorithms. To please those concerned with its military due to the advancements made in the UK, Wim Kok promised the development of new and improved destroyers for the Dutch Royal Navy. Then in the beginning of July, word came out that the virus had spread to even more countries, including Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, and Togo. In a matter of weeks, the infected countries had changed from 3 to 6.